Good morning, hello, and good evening. I'm Hiroshi Abe from Kyoto, and I'm very happy to be here. And I am very much appreciative of your Professor Hongaro. Thank you so much for your great efforts to organize this workshop. And today I would like to present a humble talk titled Heidegger and Nishida on Being and Nothingness. But as you will see in this presentation, I would like to mainly focus on Heidegger, and I would like to, if I may say so, criticize Heidegger's philosophy. And Nishida is just a tool or mean to criticize Heidegger. So let me start the presentation. Introduction. I would like to begin this presentation with an anecdote concerning. Sorry?
You have to switch microphone off of our computers. Okay, now it's fine.
Okay. Let me restart. I would like to begin this presentation with an anecdote concerning the one-off meeting of the Japanese Buddhist scholar and Kitaro Nishida's best friend, D.T. Suzuki, with Martin Heidegger in 1953. According to Mihoko Okamura, who was Suzuki's personal secretary and accompanied Suzuki to the meeting, Heidegger had already. Thank you. Does this work? Can you hear me?
If you can move the text.
Yes. And can you see the text?
Yeah, it should be working.
Yeah.
There's no one computer.
Okay. Okay, fine. No news is good news. Okay, I would like to begin by. I would like to begin by with Mihoko Okamura, where was her name? According to Mihoko Okamura, who was Suzuki's personal secretary and accompanied Suzuki to the meeting, Heidegger had already read a copy of Suzuki's book titled Essays in Zen Buddhism, the copy gifted by the Japanese philosopher and Nishida's disciple, Keiji Nishitani. In relation to this book, Heidegger asked the author, Suzuki, how to do the Zen meditation. Suzuki gave a direct answer by his own bodily postures. For example, sitting with the both legs crossed, holding the hands, breathing in a relaxed and deep manner, and so forth. Thereafter, Suzuki asked Heidegger in turn, how do you posture when you are thinking? Heidegger made no reply. Heidegger merely introduced the symposium instead. As a male-only bucket in ancient Greece, whose participants leaned on the left elbow on couches, sharing food, wine, and conversations. This episode reminds me of the motto proposed by the 15th to 16th century Chinese Neo-Confucian thinker, Wang Yanmin, the motto of the unity of knowing and acting, Qixing Hei in Japanese, Chiko Goit, of which Nishida makes much, citing this model in an inquiry into the good. I understand one's praise to be the imperative that your knowing something should be interconnected with knowing yourself, and such knowledge de re and de se ought to be accompanied by and cultivated through your practical bodily, or more precisely, psychophysical actions in a normative and disciplined manner, and that the knowledge and the action should be well proportioned, each developed to a high degree. In my view, it was this idea that served Suzuki as the background of the above-mentioned question, namely the question that presumes the existence of some practical and embodied form or forms corresponding to Heidegger's thinking. However, it seems to me that such an idea never occurred to Heidegger, and neither could Heidegger make a straight answer, nor conceivably even see the point of Suzuki's apparently embarrassing, strange question. Sorry. Interestingly, in this context, we can also draw on a comment of the Japanese philosopher and Nishitani's disciple, Shizuteru Ueda, on Meister Eckhart and Heidegger. Ueda, late in his life, says, quote, Ueda, I can clearly address the divergence between Eckhart and Heidegger. As is shown in his preachings, Eckhart's thinking was rooted in practice, whereas Heidegger's thinking didn't derive from any practices in the sense of Eckhart, even though Heidegger too might have practiced, albeit in his own fashion. I believe it is worthwhile asking yourself whether it is meaningful if you strive to establish in philosophy your words from practice in a self-satisfied fashion without practicing in the true sense of the word. Undoubtedly, however, we can affirm that Heidegger is a genuine thinker. He perfectly teaches us what it is to think, unquote. This passage reveals that Ueda thinks much more highly of Eckhart than Heidegger in terms of the very idea of the unity of knowing and acting, or of thinking and practice, pointing out an insufficiency of Heidegger's practice. That being so, from Heidegger's halfway practice or life experience, it seems to follow that his thinking, Heidegger's thinking, is not thoroughgoing either. Unlike Ueda's positive estimation of Heidegger as a thinker, this means that Heidegger cannot compare with Eckhart in terms of thinking, as he cannot compare with Eckhart in terms of practice. Why? The reason can be explained by what Rainer Schurman calls a practical a priori. What does this mean? Eckhart's sermon on spiritual poverty, number 52 in Quint edition, famously teaches as follows, quote, as long as you don't equal this truth, you will not understand this speech. To grasp the meaning of this statement, it is advisable to quote Schurman's insightful comment. Quote, it is probably possible to reproduce Eckhart's experience of being, but only on one condition. An attitude is required for thinking to succeed. To think of being as releasement, Gelassenheit, we must first of all have a released existence, unquote. According to Schurman, practice should have priority over thinking in the sense that unless we are already somehow living the attitude or experience which Eckhart lived, then we will not be in a position to follow and think about what Eckhart thought and preached. An objection may come up here. As his book titled Heidegger on Being and Acting shows, by the notion of the practical a priori, Schurman himself rather designates the uniqueness of Heidegger's philosophy positively, connecting it to the tradition of Eckhart's mysticism. Indeed, I agree with Schurman that Heidegger had lifelong respect for Eckhart, adopting and adapting Eckhartian vocabulary, Abgrund, Armut, Gelassenheit, Latin, Wesen, and so forth, and conceptions, for example, the relation between God and the soul, living without a why, etc. According to Heidegger, Eckhart is a master of letters and life, who has accompanied Heidegger since 1910, and whose influence is likely to make his philosophy echo Asian thought. I think this is interesting to us. On the other hand, however, it is undeniable that Heidegger carefully keeps distancing himself from Eckhart, evading a philosophical confrontation with this old master's thinking. To give an example, in the principle of reason, der Satz von Grund, Heidegger argues there remains an unsaid significant thought in Angela's Silesius, saying, the rose is without why. It blooms because it blooms. It is a thought that a quote, humans are not truly in the most concealed ground of their essential being until, in their own way, humans are in the same way as the rose is, without why, unquote. Referring to this thought, Heidegger obviously suggests Eckhart's idea, which is represented in Expositio Sancti Evangelii Secundum Johannem, the idea that, quote, that which is without a principle properly lived. Nevertheless, Heidegger's consideration suddenly stops and ends up with the following enigmatic remark, quote, we cannot pursue this thought any further here, unquote. Does not this sweeping and elusive gesture imply that Heidegger's knowing and acting, or Heidegger's thinking and practice, do not achieve such high level of harmony as Eckhart's have done, Eckhart's knowing and acting have done? Much more importantly, in my view, this suspicion of a deficiency of the unity of thinking and practice even reaches the core of Heidegger's philosophy, namely his thought of being, or more accurately, of being and nothingness. In what follows, dealing with Heidegger's well-known essay, What is Metaphysics?, abbreviated hereafter to WIM, and his other works relevant to this essay, I would like to point out that there is a problem with his theory of being and the nothingness. Oh, sorry. At first glance, the thesis which WIM put forth concerning the relationship between being and nothingness seems very simple and clear. It famously said, quote, being and the nothingness belong together. As to this relationship, Heidegger's 1969 seminar in Luthor offered an additional and suggestive explanation, which states that, quote, being, nothingness, the identical, therewith, unquote. As is shown in what is called thinking, was Heideggerian, Heidegger regards the term therewith as equivalent for the Greek word to auto used in Parmenides' fragment. For thinking, quote, for thinking and being is identical. For thinking and being is identical. Togar auto noen estin te kai enai, unquote. That being so, how does Heidegger elucidate this Greek word? If I'm not mistaken, there are 2 points of his interpretation, Heidegger's interpretation. Suppose that A and B are identical to auto in the sense of Parmenides. First, even if so, A and B are completely different from each other. Thinking is one thing and being is another. Second, despite this dissimilarity, A owes its own identity as A to B and vice versa, so that they necessarily belong together. That being so, it can be said that Heidegger sharply distinguishes nothingness from being, albeit on the conditions that, on account of its respective self-identity, each of them requires the other. In what sense, then, does being owe its beingness to the nothingness? Due to time constraints, I must be content to tackle only this question without stating the reason why the nothingness needs being in turn. Oh, sorry. Let me return to WIM and focus on Heidegger's analysis of the fundamental experience of the nothingness. In the mood of anxiety, which causes the suspension of the total network of significance Bedeutsamkeit relations in the world, we suddenly find ourselves detached from all the things and persons that we dealt with before the attack of anxiety. As a result, quote, all things and we ourselves sink into indifference, unquote. To put it briefly, quote, the anxiety brings forth the slipping away, doesn't gliding, of beings as a whole, unquote. What, however, is the source of anxiety's unique function to force beings, whatever they are, to slip away? Heidegger considers this function to owe its origin to the nothingness as something indeterminate and indeterminable, producing the very mood of anxiety, or more precisely, to the working of this nothingness that Heidegger calls to Nos, Nichten, or nothing, Nichtung. As Heidegger puts it in WIM, through such working, nothingness distinguishes itself from beings as a whole and repels or refuses, abweisen them insofar as they are beings and not, in any sense, nothing. By doing so, this nothing of the nothingness also makes beings possible as beings for the first time and refers verweisen to these beings in light of their being, namely to the being of beings at the same time. If this is the case, then we can insist that the nothingness originates beings and the being of beings. In Heidegger's words, the nothingness lies in the, quote, the primary working of enabling the revelation of beings in general, die vorgängige Ermöglichung der Offenbarkeit vom Sein dem Überhaupt. And thereby, in quote, the working of enabling the revelation of beings as such for human Dasein, unquote. Here, it is noteworthy that the latter phrase, that is namely the working of enabling the revelation of beings as such for human Dasein, already appears in the original version of the essay. Furthermore, in this original version, we also read, quote, if the nothingness were not revealed, Dasein could not exist. It is not until then, that is to say, the self-revelation of the nothingness, that Dasein revealed itself for itself as existing Dasein, unquote. In short, Heidegger emphasizes from the beginning the pivotal role of the nothingness as the primordial sine qua non for beings in general, including our own Dasein and the being of beings. Let us call this the sine qua non claim. It now becomes clear that this claim of central importance answers the aforementioned question, namely, in what sense does being owe what it is to the nothingness? The reply is as follows. In the sense that the being of the beings couldn't be revealed as such if it were not for the nothing of the nothingness. I think Heidegger obviously confirms this answer when Heidegger highlights, quote, being itself is essentially finite and reveals itself only in the transcendence of Dasein, which is poured out into the nothingness. On the other hand, in WIM, we also hear a different voice challenge the sine qua non claim. This essay not only states that, quote, in the being of beings occurs the nothing of the nothingness, but also that, quote, the nothingness revealed itself as belonging to the being of beings, unquote. Cannot these passages read that, contrary to the sine qua non claim, we should think of the working of nothing to derive from and pertain to the being of beings? Not only this, in the original version, where am I? Okay. In the original version, Heidegger already deviates from the claim insofar as Heidegger contends, quote, as such working of enabling the revelation of beings as such, the nothingness essentially belongs to human Dasein existence, unquote. We thus come to be faced with a a discrepancy between WIM's two opposing thoughts on being and the nothingness, I think. One thought is pro, the sine qua non claim, according with the above thesis that being and the nothingness belong together or are identical in the sense of Parmenides, despite their difference. Based on this view, it stresses the primacy of the nothingness over being. Contrariwise, the other thought is contra the claim. This standpoint considers the so-called nothing of the nothingness to be, in fact, the working originating from and pertaining to being, so that the nothingness must be assimilated with being. As we know, after WIM, Heidegger fundamentally stands for the latter position, that is contra to the sine qua non claim. For instance, a self-commentary which Heidegger formulates in the essay titled On the Question of Being, zur Seinsfrage, explains that what WIM names the nothingness is, in reality, being. That is to say, being, insofar as it is seen as not beings, nicht Seiendes, from the ontic level or beings-centered perspective of scientific representation. Thus, it is not nothingness in general, but solely this nothingness, in Heidegger's words, this nothingness, namely the nothingness in the particular sense of a certain disguise for being that WIM investigates. Similarly, another retrospective commentary made in 1963 with respect to WIM reads that what is named nothingness in this 1929 essay can be named being as well. The former name, the nothingness, is due to it, as long as it cannot be counted as beings by any means, nicht Seiendes, non-beings. At the same time, the latter name being too is proper for it because it makes beings possible as such. Furthermore, a letter on humanism, a brief über Humanismus, Heidegger famously reconsiders the nothingness, the nothing, Nichtung, as follows. Quote, to not, das Nichten, essentially occurs in being itself. Being not as being, unquote. On the other hand, as is shown in the 1969 Luthor seminar that we have mentioned, Heidegger consistently sticks fast to the thesis that being and the nothingness belong together. Even on the question of being, where, as we have seen, the nothingness as WIM thematizes it is elucidated as being, Heidegger depicts their relationship as follows. The relationship between being and the nothingness as follows. Quote, one exerts itself for the other in a kinship whose essential abundance we have hardly yet considered. Being as little or as scarcely is as the nothingness. However, there is a giving of both, escaped by this, unquote. That being the case, how in the world or however can this being the nothingness dualism of the thesis be compatible with the being-centric monism of the above position against the sine qua non claim? This is the problem that I have with Heidegger's theory of being and the nothingness. Obviously, this problem comes from Heidegger's marked shift from the acceptance to the refusal of the sine qua non claim. What then does this turn stem from? In his book titled Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, Heidegger supposes why Kant republished Critique of Purism by revising its original A version, which, following Heidegger's reading, considered transcendental imagination, transzendentale Einbildungskraft, to be, quote, a common, but to us unknown root, unquote, of sensible intuition and conceptual understanding. And the second B edition of the book, in Heidegger's words, what? Kant has shrunk back before this unknown root, unquote, zurückweichen vor. Imitating this passage, cannot we say that Heidegger's above stated turn comes from his shrinking back before the nothingness or an insufficiency of his fundamental experience of the nothingness? I believe we can say so. In WIM, Heidegger describes the mood of anxiety in the following way, quote, in anxiety occurs a shrinking back before, ein Zurückweichen vor, which is naturally no longer any kind of flight, but rather a charmed hum, unquote. It merits mentioning that this shrinking back before has two meanings, which trigger the above turn. In shrinking back, we have caught a glimpse of something at the sight of which we begin to recoil. In this sense, in anxiety, we have faced the nothingness and seen its original workings as the sine qua non, albeit very briefly. At the same time, to shrink back means to draw back from something into something else. Hence, anxiety motivates us to distance ourselves from the nothingness, namely the origin from which all beings as beings come to be, by moving elsewhere, so that, owing to such distancing, we calmly face, but at the same time, in a charmed manner, deal with the nothingness. In this situation, there is room for revising the nothingness and thereby turning to the denial of the sine qua non claim, I think. In shrinking back from the nothingness, where do we move to? As pointed out by the Japanese philosopher and Nishitani's disciple, Koichi Tsujimura, it is the Da of Dasein, or the world of the being in the world, which should be characterized as the place near from the origin, whose nearness is, to be precise, the closeness of remoteness, Nähe der Ferne, due to the aforementioned distancing. Stretching out from this Da, according to Heidegger, we come to be held out into hineingehalten in the nothingness. As long as we are neighboring witness close to its nothing in this way, we are, so to speak, the custodians or the placeholders, placeholder of the nothingness. Furthermore, as long as we are such placeholders or the substitute placeholder for the nothingness, through whose activity is nothing indirectly works for the revelation of beings in terms of their being, we can also be the shepherd of being, whose mission lies in, quote, allowing space for beings based on the Da as the space of being. In short, we, Dasein, dwell in the Da, that is to say, the place that is near from the nothingness, and that we hold and reserve, so to speak, as a space for concursus narius, namely the concurrence or cooperation of the nothingness. As Heidegger writes, quote, the nothingness is manifest in the ground of Dasein, unquote. Heidegger famously calls the Dasein in this special state the pure Dasein. The Dasein that the nothingness causing that above stated slipping away of beings has stripped from its personal and social identity. For example, quote, name, status, occupation, role, age, and fate as mine and yours, unquote. Deprived of all these characteristics and impoverished in this way, the pure Dasein is as naked as, quote, an indifferent nobody, unquote. However, we must say even this pure Dasein is not yet penurious and not yet poor. Why? In the sermon mentioned earlier, Eckhart teaches, quote, if it is the case that a human is free of all creatures, of God, and of self, and if it is still the case that God finds a place in her, in this human, to work, then we say that as long as this is in that human, she is not poor with the truest poverty. We thus say humans must be so poor that they neither are nor have a place where God could work, unquote. As we see, according to Eckhart's view, the pure Dasein must discard this very Da. To put it another way, we, Dasein, may not stay there, namely, at the place near, but already far from the origin. But we, Dasein, must be here as one with the nothingness. According to my reading, this is what Nishida means when he criticizes Heidegger's notion of Dasein or being there as follows, quote, I am not someone who is there, そこに, but must be here, ここに. From here, do we see there, unquote. If this is the case, how does Nishida think we can enter into the nothingness? Due to the difficulty of this question, of course, this question is very difficult to answer, and due to time constraints, Please allow me to provide a very, very short and rough sketch of my tentative answer. According to my reading of Nishida, we don't have to enter into the nothingness as long as our true self is nothing but what Nishida calls a true or absolute nothingness. We cannot know this without the self-awareness, jikaku, of the absolute nothingness, which is completely non-objectifiable. Because of this very trait, it is worth naming the absolute nothingness. The absolute nothingness can be compared to a mirror that reflects and expresses itself on itself, albeit not as such, the mirror, but as all other things. Like this self-mirroring mirror, through its self-determination, the absolute nothingness reflects and sees in itself as being and beings, and thereby makes them possible. Thus, the self-awareness of the absolute nothingness teaches us that, quote, being must be enveloped, 包む, in the true nothingness, unquote. However, to really understand this, Nishida contends, we need some religious consciousness. And we can know its content, the content of religious consciousness. After all, we can know this content, after all, quote, only through religious experiences, unquote. The experiences that require us to unite our knowing and acting through embodied practices. Thank you so much for your
Professor Habe, I think we have, yes, and maximum 15 minutes for discussion. I'm sorry, this morning we have 4 speakers, therefore I have to stay in time. So maybe this question could be from Professor Lopez.
Please. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And I really mean formal. I'm gonna go straight to my question.
Yes.
I've always wanted somebody to discuss relationship between 4 terms, and this seems to be the ideal opportunity. The difference between the Japanese word mu,
Yes.
the German word ni, relationship between Dasein and the non-self, which seems to be going to the core of your paper, if I understand correctly. And if I understand correctly, the critique is that while Heidegger can say that Dasein is disclosed against the field of nothingness,
Yes.
Heidegger,
Close to, but already far from.
Heidegger cannot, and so therefore there's always a distance. Heidegger cannot say that Dasein itself is empty or a non-self. If I understood the critique correctly.
Yes.
And this all hinges on how I think we're to understand these 2 terms, mu and needs. And then at the end, when Nishida says, I am not something who is there,
Yes.
but must be here. Here, do we see there? The next term I would like to ask about is the da in the Dasein, because the da in the Dasein can be here or there. And in being in time, for example, if you really wanted to be specific, or clearer in the translation. In the first part up to about the schema, you'd have to do the there. And so Dasein is here, there, being in here in the world.
Mhm.
And so there's a play on the here and there in Heidegger in the Dasein.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if Nishida understands this, and if that means that we can join the concept of non-self and Dasein together through the Da, the here, there, the non-self, self.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay.
Well, I'm sorry for my simple questions. You all know I'm still new to this world, so these are the opportunity for someone to explain this.
Sorry, actually, my question is I think complementary to yours, maybe.
Okay, well, then let's ask,
Oh, please,
if you can
please,
ask your
please.
question,
Yeah,
forget about mine, don't worry about
Sorry, yeah. So
Thank you so much.
it. No, don't worry about mine.
I also have some difficulty understanding like this idea of Dasein in Heidegger.
Yes.
I once actually wrote an article called like Dasein or something like that. So
Okay.
isn't it like Dasein, since it can be, it usually means there, it
Mhm.
can also mean here. Isn't like
Oh, I
this
wish I could
almost
do that.
kind of contradiction,
Mhm.
a way for us to help to understand what Heidegger is talking about nichts,
Mhm.
right? Like since the Dasein, I am Dasein, but I'm there. Isn't it like complementary in order to be able to understand the nichts? That's just to complement Steve's.
Okay.
No, you can answer his question, don't worry about mine.
No,
Mine
I would
obviously
like
is
to,
too simple.
I would like to, so, as a boss questions, of course.
No.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for these important questions. So, of course, by the word, by the term Dasein, we can mean being there, as well as being here, as well as being there. I agree with you in this regard. But if we consider Nishida, so the citation at the end of my presentation, the citation from Nishida, he clearly interpret the word Dasein as being there.
Yeah.
そこに
That's Nishida's understanding, right?
according to Nishida's understanding. And if when so Nishida interprets Dasein as being there by the term here, or in contrast with this there, by the term here, Nishida means the place of Eien no Ima, the eternal now. And if I may say so, we could correspond this place of the eternal now, Eien no Ima, to the nothingness in the context of Heidegger, or the origin, Ursprung. And so I would like to focus on this interpretation by Nishida. So I in the presentation I only focus on the meaning of the word Dasein as being there and not being here. So, this is my answer.
I agree. That's why.
If later you could respond to my question privately, that would be nice, because I think my question went to the point of your paper. And it was to join the two and talk about Moon, but we can talk about that later.
Okay.
I'm sure or I can just go read it myself. So.
Okay, sorry for reason of time, Martin, you can ask Professor Abe.
I got it.
We have two questions from people on Zoom, but probably we have to, we can probably hear only one question from Professor Ilan. I don't know if we have enough time for Professor Yusuf. Professor Ilan, please.
I'll try to make it brief, so there's time. You guys can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for a very interesting paper. I mean, there are a number of things I'd like to ask about, but I'd like to read the paper more carefully beforehand. I'm wondering if you could say more about you said at the beginning that you were going to present a critique of Heidegger, and I'm not sure it's clear to me what that is. So at the end of the paper you presented, it sounded like to me an alternate conception of nothingness, right? From Nishida, it sounded like, the passages we're citing were from relatively early works from Nishida in the early 20s, I gather. And so I'm just curious, how you see that as a critique. I mean, it's a conception of nothingness where the self has a certain identity to nothingness that is lacking in Heidegger. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference there and, how you see that as a critique of Heidegger's conception of nothingness. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And your question addresses the core of what I would like to say in the presentation. Thank you. And so the point of my talk today is that Heidegger's thinking on Dasein is, so to speak, insufficient from the viewpoint of Nishida and Eckhart. In what sense? Why? Because from the viewpoint of Eckhart and Nishida, I combine these thinkers together in this context. Heidegger's Dasein is not committed with the nothingness in the true sense of in the true sense, according to Heidegger, Nishida and Eckhart, and as I quoted from Eckhart at the end of my presentation, Eckhart insists that we don't have to be appraised or a place where we may not appraise where God worked, because if we were still appraised, we would be we would distance ourselves already distance ourselves from the God or from the nothingness, and so this distancing or this gap is already a problem, and from my so according to my reading, this very distance makes Heidegger possible, so enables Heidegger to reconsider the nothingness as a part of being in his later thinking. So, so what I find problematic in Heidegger's thinking is that Heidegger is moving. So Heidegger doesn't or didn't decide his attitude toward the nothingness and beings. So is the nothingness different from being, or is the nothingness a part of being or other aspect of being? So to my eyes, so he was so wondering whether this is the case. And in my presentation, I would like to say that the reason why Heidegger cannot decide his position is that he thinks of Dasein in his meaning to a place far from, or already far from the nothingness. This is a point.
Great, that's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
So, Yusa, if you can put your question really briefly, I allow you to make your question. Otherwise,
it will be very brief. This is one place I am not so sure if Nishida's statement on Dasein, the word Dasein, was correct. And I think he was playing with the words, and somehow he made a mistake, I think. So we need to be careful when we talk about Nishida's terminology sometimes, because we are not natives of French or German language. And this occurred to me because one time I was speaking to my German colleague about my German language, and we discussed a little bit auf Deutsch. Und dann sie gesagt, oh, schon da. Meaning, grammar, 私のグラマーが schon da。あなたの中にはもう文法が入っていますと。だからそういうレベルでは心配しなくていいから、もっと別な風にお勉強なさいませみたいに言われたのね。で、schon daというそのだっていうのはね、そことかこことかっていうよりも存在しているという。
そうです。例えば、ich bin da, da bin ich. So, I'm here. そう、だから、I'm present ってことですね。
だから、present, and it's there, and it is existing. ということですね。だからね、そこでね、ヒアザインとかダーザインとかいうこと言ったってどうしようもない、拉致が開かないんで、こういうことはやっぱりネイティブの人たちと相談しながらね、正しい理解をしつつ、ハイデガーを読み、西田を読むともっとね、意味のあるディスカッションが出てくるんじゃないかなと。まず簡単にさっきこのダーザインだなんかいろんなあれが疑問がロフツさんから出たので、たった一つ私の経験からね、びっくりして、ああ、そういう。
おっしゃる通りです。はい。
はい、すみませんでした。簡単です。
Thank you so much.
Tanabe, thank you very much for your talk. We don't have any other time to continue the discussion, and I hope we can continue during lunch break. But so thank you.
Thank you so much.